In the sweltering summer of 1971, behind the imposing walls of the Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York, tension simmered like steam inside a sealed pressure cooker, hot, invisible, and dangerously ignored. Attica was built for 1,200 inmates. By August, nearly 2,300 men were packed inside. The air was stale, the food barely edible. Prisoners shared crammed cells and were allowed only one shower a week, a meager attempt at hygiene in an environment crawling with frustration. Each man received one roll of toilet paper per month, as if dignity could be rationed. Basic medical care was a gamble, not a guarantee. Yet it wasn't just the physical deprivation that gnawed at the inmates. It was the systemic erasure of their humanity. Letters from loved ones were censored or withheld without explanation. Religious practices were obstructed. Books were banned. Black and Latino inmates, who made up the majority of the population, found themselves under the command of an almost exclusively white rural guard force, many of whom harbored deep racial biases. Conversations laced with slurs were common. Brutality was routine. Accountability was absent. Carlos Roche, an inmate who would survive the events that followed, later recounted the bitter relationship between guards and prisoners. "They didn't look at us as men," he said. "We were animals to them, and when you treat someone like an animal long enough, eventually, he's going to bite back." The administration had long been warned. Inmates had submitted grievances throughout the spring and summer, a 27-point manifesto of demands that detailed everything from overcrowding to censorship, religious freedom to parole reform. Their demands were not revolutionary, they were basic human rights. But those cries for help echoed off concrete walls and fell on deaf ears in Albany. Inside Attica, the divide was not just physical, it was racial, social, and emotional. Most inmates came from the inner cities of Buffalo, New York City, and Rochester. Most guards lived in the rural areas surrounding the prison. There was mutual resentment, but only one side had the authority and weapons. Despite the rising tensions, the prison operated with a cold mechanical rhythm: wake-up calls, chow lines, head counts, yard time, lockdowns, repeat. But beneath this rigid schedule, a storm brewed. The inmates were not just restless, they were angry, humiliated, and increasingly organized. What made Attica different from other prisons was the unity emerging among its inmates. Despite racial and gang divisions, prisoners began to hold discussions in the yard. Black, white, Latino, men who might have once fought each other, were now exchanging ideas and grievances. There was a growing awareness that their real struggle wasn't with each other, but with the system that confined and dehumanized them. Even some correctional officers sensed the powder keg waiting to explode. A few had privately expressed concerns to their supervisors, warning that a riot was inevitable if conditions didn't change. But the administration chose the path of denial. Then came the final straw. In early September, a confrontation between guards and inmates over a minor disciplinary issue escalated into violence. Word spread fast. Inmates were beaten and thrown into solitary. The resentment that had been simmering for years was now on the verge of combustion. In the weeks leading up to the riot, Attica was a prison in name, but a war zone in spirit. What the authorities saw as compliance was really exhaustion. The silence wasn't peace, it was pressure. And all pressure eventually finds a release. Attica was about to erupt. It began not with a grand act of rebellion, but with a misstep, a spark in the powder keg. On the morning of September 9th, 1971, tensions that had been bubbling for months finally boiled over. The trigger was deceptively small, a dispute over which inmates would be sent through a particular tunnel in the prison. This tunnel, narrow and confined, had long been a site of harassment and intimidation. That morning, a group of prisoners refused the order to pass through. The refusal quickly escalated into a confrontation. Guards reacted with force. Fists flew. One officer was struck. What followed was not chaos, but organized fury. Word of the incident spread rapidly through the prison. Dozens of inmates in cell block A began breaking down gates and overpowering guards. Others from cell blocks B and C joined in. Within minutes, the prison erupted into full-scale revolt. Fire extinguishers were discharged. Furniture was smashed. Prisoners armed themselves with whatever they could find: metal pipes, sticks, makeshift shields. The epicenter of the uprising was D-Yard, a massive outdoor space surrounded by 30-foot walls. By mid-morning, over 1,200 inmates had seized control of D-Yard, along with the prison's control center, the nerve center of security operations. 42 correctional officers and civilian employees were captured and taken hostage. The guards, now stripped of their uniforms, blindfolded and tied, were brought into D-Yard under prisoner control. Some were injured, many were terrified. But remarkably, the uprising did not descend into pure violence. Led by a group of prisoner spokesmen, many of them politically conscious men who had studied law, civil rights, and revolution, the inmates began organizing. A security perimeter was established around the yard. Guard hostages were protected. A makeshift medical center was set up for the wounded, both inmates and staff. Discipline was enforced. Looting was minimal. Then came the declaration. The inmates quickly drafted a formal statement, a list of 29 demands typed and posted for the world to see. These demands were neither radical nor vague. They called for basic rights, medical treatment, religious freedom, fair parole hearings, an end to racial discrimination, and improved living conditions. "We are men," the statement read. "We are not beasts, and we do not intend to be beaten or driven as such." One demand stood above the rest: complete amnesty for all those involved in the uprising. Outside the walls, chaos met disbelief. The New York state government scrambled to respond. Helicopters hovered over the facility. State troopers lined the perimeter. The National Guard was placed on alert. Governor Nelson Rockefeller, however, remained distant, both physically and emotionally. Despite repeated requests from inmates, mediators, and even his own staff, he refused to visit Attica. Instead, a group of outside citizen observers was invited in. This diverse group included journalists, politicians, lawyers, and civil rights activists, among them Bobby Seale, co-founder of the Black Panther Party, and Tom Wicker, a columnist for the New York Times. Their role was crucial: to act as neutral witnesses, to hear both sides, and to assist in mediation. The observers entered D-Yard cautiously, unsure of what they'd find. What they saw astonished them. Despite the burning wreckage in parts of the prison and the tension in the air, the yard itself was orderly. Inmates spoke with passion, not madness. They described years of neglect and abuse. They pleaded not just for themselves, but for the system to be fixed. Wicker would later write that he had never been prouder to be an American than when listening to those inmates speak with dignity and reason. Negotiations began slowly. The prisoners formed a negotiation committee with elected spokespeople. The state sent representatives, though the governor remained absent. Over the next 3 days, talks would continue, but trust, already thin, would continue to fray. Behind the scenes, state officials grew increasingly anxious. Rumors of prisoner executions, rape, and violence were circulated, many false, others exaggerated. Pressure mounted to end the standoff swiftly, but inside D-Yard, the inmates held firm. They would not surrender without amnesty. They would not return to their cages until they were seen and treated as men. For 4 days, D-Yard stood as both a prison within a prison and a free territory, a place where oppressed men claimed power, however briefly. But the clock was ticking, and those in power were growing impatient. The most violent day in American prison history was only hours away. For 4 days, the yard held. Within the 600 square feet of D-Yard, over 1,000 inmates remained in tense, determined control. Around them, the full might of the state of New York gathered like a noose tightening by the hour. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Hundreds of state troopers, correctional officers, and National Guardsmen stood armed outside the prison fences, fingers on triggers. But inside, a fragile dialogue was still alive. Commissioner Russell Oswald, New York's top corrections official, was caught in the eye of this storm. He walked into D-Yard, spoke with the prisoners face to face, and listened to the cries for justice. Oswald, unlike the distant governor above him, saw the humanity in the men before him. He understood the legitimacy of many of their 29 demands, and publicly agreed to meet most of them. Inmates cheered. Progress seemed possible. But one line remained uncrossed: amnesty. The prisoners had demanded full protection from retaliation for all who took part in the uprising. They feared what the state might do if they surrendered. But Oswald, under pressure from law enforcement and politicians, refused to guarantee amnesty. He promised fairness, but not immunity. Hope flickered. Then it faltered. The turning point came with the death of Officer William Quinn, one of the hostages. Quinn had been badly injured in the early hours of the riot, struck in the head during the initial chaos, and died in a hospital on September 11th. His death hardened public sentiment and stiffened the resolve of officials in Albany. Negotiations stalled. A deal that once seemed close now appeared impossible. Distrust deepened. The observers, those few citizens who had entered D Yard and pleaded for peace, begged Governor Nelson Rockefeller to come in person. They argued that his presence might restore calm, prevent catastrophe. But Rockefeller, unwilling to appear weak or be linked to the rebellion, refused to set foot in Attica. Instead, he prepared for war. At 9:46 a.m. on September 13th, without warning, the skies over D Yard roared to life. A helicopter swept overhead, dropping canisters of CS tear gas onto the prisoners and hostages below. Inmates screamed, hostages wept. Then came the gunfire. Over 2,000 rounds of live ammunition were fired by state troopers, corrections officers, and sharpshooters stationed on rooftops and guard towers. Bullets tore through bodies indiscriminately. Some inmates tried to shield the hostages, others ran. Many simply dropped to the ground, hands raised in surrender. It didn't matter. The shooting lasted just 6 minutes, but its effects were eternal. When the smoke cleared, 39 men were dead, 29 inmates, and 10 hostages. All 10 hostages were killed by gunfire, not by prisoners, as the state would initially claim, but by the bullets of their supposed rescuers. Many had been shot in the back, in the head at close range. What followed was not rescue, but retaliation. Survivors were stripped naked, beaten, and forced to crawl through mud and broken glass. Guards carved racial slurs into prisoners' backs with knives. Medical treatment was denied to the wounded. D Yard, once a symbol of defiance, became a site of torture. Then came the cover-up. Within hours, state officials falsely reported that the hostages had been slashed and killed by inmates. They spoke of throat slitting and mutilation. These lies were quickly published in newspapers across the country, feeding the narrative that the assault had been necessary, even heroic. But the truth had already begun to surface. Autopsy reports, conducted by outside coroners, revealed a very different reality. All 10 hostages had died from gunshot wounds, inflicted by law enforcement. Not a single throat had been cut. There were no mutilations. The state had killed its own. When the truth became undeniable, outrage followed, but accountability did not. No troopers or officers were ever prosecuted for the massacre. Instead, dozens of inmates were charged. Investigations dragged on. Lawsuits multiplied. Public trust eroded. Over time, the myth of the violent inmate gave way to the truth of state-sponsored brutality. Attica's name would forever carry the weight of that morning. A moment of potential transformation, of peaceful resolution, was buried beneath tear gas and bullets. In its place stood the grim reality of American power, that when faced with resistance from the oppressed, the state too often chooses violence over justice, force over dialogue. And so D Yard fell, not because the inmates gave up, but because the government did. When the last gunshot echoed over the walls of Attica on September 13th, 1971, the smoke cleared, but the wounds remained wide open. The massacre had ended the uprising, but it had not restored order. What followed was not calm, but national outrage, years of litigation, and a slow reckoning with the truth. The immediate aftermath inside the prison was brutal. Inmates who had survived the state's violent retaking of D Yard were stripped, beaten, and tortured. Men were forced to crawl through sewage and broken glass while being kicked, spat on, and degraded. Reports emerged of prisoners being urinated on by guards, burned with cigarettes, and denied food or medical care. Outside, the state's version of events began to unravel. Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who had authorized the assault and never set foot in the prison, had confidently told the public that inmates had slit the hostages' throats. His administration insisted that the violence had been unavoidable, but by the end of the week, autopsy reports proved otherwise. All hostages had died of gunshot wounds. There were no slit throats. There had been no executions by inmates. The state had killed its own employees and lied about it. The backlash was swift. Public figures, journalists, clergy, and activists condemned the state's actions. The McKay Commission, an independent body led by respected attorney Robert McKay, was assembled to investigate the events. Its findings were damning. The report declared that the assault had been reckless, that many lives could have been saved through continued negotiation, and that the use of force was excessive and unnecessary. The commission labeled the government's cover-up attempt as a tragic failure of leadership. In the courts, the battle had only begun. Over the next 3 decades, hundreds of former inmates launched civil rights lawsuits against the state of New York. They sought compensation for the torture, abuse, and unlawful killings that had occurred after the prison was retaken. The legal struggle dragged on for years. Finally, in 2000, the state agreed to a settlement of $8 million to be split among more than 500 surviving inmates and families of those killed. But it wasn't just the prisoners who fought for justice. The families of the slain hostages, many of whom had initially believed the state's lies, also demanded answers. They sought acknowledgement that their loved ones had been killed not by prisoners, but by the state. In 2005, 34 years after the massacre, New York awarded $12 million to the families of the deceased hostages in what many viewed as a quiet admission of guilt. Yet no government official, no law enforcement officer, no prison guard was ever held criminally responsible for the bloodshed at Attica. Still, something powerful had shifted. Attica had exposed a hidden world of cruelty inside America's prison system. For decades, inmates had suffered in silence, beaten, dehumanized, voiceless behind bars. But Attica broke that silence. The 29 demands drafted during the uprising, ranging from medical care to freedom of religion, became a blueprint for prison reform movements across the country. Organizations advocating for prisoners' rights grew in strength. Law students studied the legal injustices of the case. Civil liberties groups like the ACLU and Center for Constitutional Rights took on more prison-related cases. Attica became more than a prison. It became a symbol of brutality, yes, but also of resistance. Today, Attica stands in the public imagination as a reminder that prisons are not isolated worlds. They are reflections of our society, that those behind bars are still human, that a cry for dignity, if unheard, will become a scream. In popular culture, Attica has been immortalized in books, documentaries, songs, and films. From Al Pacino's famous chant, "Attica, Attica," in Dog Day Afternoon to modern hip-hop lyrics, the word echoes not just as a place, but as a warning. Reform has come slowly and unevenly. Mass incarceration, racial disparities, and prison abuse remain central issues in America's justice system. But Attica helped spark a national conversation. It forced the public to see behind prison walls. And it laid the foundation for a modern prisoners' rights movement, rooted in the belief that justice does not end at the prison gate. Attica may have fallen in blood, but its message endures. We are men. We are not beasts. And that truth still demands to be heard.